The Deep End team acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands on which we work and live, pays respect to elders past, present and future, and recognises the importance of Indigenous knowledge to informing public debate. Welcome to The Deep End, hosted by Marcia Langton and Aaron Corn. In today's episode, we're talking to Dr. Shireen Morris, an outstanding constitutional lawyer. Shireen Morris is Director of the Radical Centre Reform Lab and a Senior Lecturer in Law at Macquarie University. She was formerly a McKenzie Postdoctoral Fellow at the Melbourne Law School and a Senior Advisor on Constitutional Reform to Cape York Institute. Shireen's PhD thesis, now published as a book, is A First Nations Voice in the Australian Constitution. Other books include Radical Hart, 3 Stories Make Us One. We're grateful to have Shireen speak with us today.
Thank you so much, Shireen, for joining us. I'm Marcia Langton. I'm at the University of Melbourne, where I'm the Associate Provost and a Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor. And with me, my partner in this podcast is Professor Aaron Corn, the Director of the Indigenous Knowledge Institute. And we are talking to Dr. Shireen Morris, a constitutional law expert who's played a major role in the development of the referendum question that Australian voters will be voting on October 14. We're coming to you from Wurundjeri and Bunurong country, here in the lands of the Kulin Nations, the unceded lands of the Kulin Nations, and we're at the wonderful Victorian College of the Arts. So, Shireen, tell us a little bit about your role as a constitutional lawyer, how you became a constitutional lawyer, and the extraordinary work that you've done on constitutional recognition of Indigenous peoples in Australia for, I think, at least a decade now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marcia. It's such a pleasure to be here with you. So it was a bit of a random, twist of fate. I was a law student down in Melbourne 12 years ago in 2011, studying at Monash. I'm of Indian and Fijian heritage, and I was born down in Melbourne. And I did this program called an Aurora internship, where you go off on your university holidays and volunteer at an Indigenous organisation. And I was lucky enough to go up to Cape York Institute on my holidays and volunteered there, and I met the Aboriginal leader, Noel Pearson. And out of the blue, he must have been impressed with something I did, because he offered me a job working on this question. How do we recognise Indigenous people in the Australian Constitution? And so I went on to work for the Institute for about 7 years. And then while I was there, I did a PhD under Melissa Caston at Monash, and on this question and sort of articulating this idea that had come up in my work with Noel of the idea of a constitutionally guaranteed Indigenous advisory body. And then I went off and did a postdoctoral fellowship at Melbourne University in the law school there, and now I'm at Macquarie University. So it's been 12 years of collaboration with Noel and other Indigenous leaders like you, and I've just learnt so much on this journey.
So tell us how the question that we're voting on October 14 was developed. I believe that there were some false starts and a few setbacks, but finally we arrived at a process, and in the end, a very, as the judges say, a sound, robust and yet practical question.
Yeah, well, as you know, Indigenous advocates have been calling for a fairer relationship with Australian governments under the Constitution for decades and decades and decades, probably 100 years or so, since the 1930s when William Cooper was petitioning the British King asking for a voice in Parliament, and the Bark petitions in the 60s calling for fairer consultation in decisions made about them and their land, and then the Barunga Statement in 88 given to Bob Hawke, asking for an Indigenous body. And subsequently ATSIC was created, but only in legislation, so it wasn't underpinned by a constitutional guarantee. And so when problems arose and the politics changed, it was chucked out. So Indigenous people have been calling for a voice for a very long time. But me, in my naivety, I just started working with Noel at the Institute, and Noel was sitting on the expert panel at that time that Julia Gillard put together, that you were on as well, Marcia. And in my naivety, I looked at the discriminatory provisions in the Constitution back then and the history of discrimination that Indigenous people suffered under the Constitution. And I thought to myself, you know what, I think we need an equality guarantee, a racial non-discrimination guarantee. So Cape York Institute pushed that idea, and the expert panel recommended that idea. And then in about 2012, when the expert panel's report was published, you recall there was that massive pushback from the political right and from constitutional conservatives saying, no, this is a one-clause Bill of Rights. And they said, you know, the argument that they made was, we don't want to put something in the Constitution that transfers power away from Parliament to the High Court, enabling the High Court to strike down Parliament's laws. So Noel said to me one day, you know, we need to rethink this whole thing. Support across the political spectrum is very important. So let's find a way to address these concerns that constitutional conservatives are raising, while at the same time addressing the aspirations of Indigenous people for substantive constitutional recognition that creates a fairer relationship with governments and delivers practical outcomes. Because, of course, Indigenous people never wanted just symbolism. They always wanted something that would deliver real practical outcomes. And so we went through this extraordinary process of reaching out to those very conservatives who were hammering us most hard about this so-called one-clause Bill of Rights. And we said to them, come on, guys, you have to admit the Constitution has presided over a lot of unfair laws and policies about Indigenous people. And they said, yes, it has. We just don't agree with your solution. We don't think the High Court should be able to strike down laws and policies. We think Parliament should be in charge of policy making. So we said, well, help us come up with a different solution that doesn't give power to the High Court, but that enables assures Indigenous people that things will happen in a fairer way than they have in the past. And these conservatives were people like the now Liberal MP, Julian Leeser, who, as you know, resigned from the shadow cabinet because he passionately supports this idea. People like Professor Anne Toomey, very respected constitutional lawyer at Sydney University. So it was through engagement with them that this alternative proposal for a constitutionally guaranteed Indigenous advisory body came about. The idea being that instead of changing the Constitution to enable the High Court to decide what's a good or bad policy and strike down policies that it found to be discriminatory, instead you could change the Constitution to guarantee Indigenous communities themselves a fairer say right at the start when laws and policies are being made about them, right? So a proactive approach rather than a reactive, litigious approach. And as much as it annoys me to admit it, those conservatives actually led us to a much superior proposal. And Marcia, I remember you being involved in those discussions as well. And, you know, ironically, they led us to a proposal that was much more in line with the long, long history of Indigenous people asking for a voice in their affairs. So in terms of the amendment that we're all voting on now, that was back in 2014 that those discussions occurred with those constitutional conservatives like Julian Leeser. Then over 8-9 years, there's been debate, discussion, deliberation, and that drafting has been refined and scrutinised and shortened and improved. So what started as a noble compromise with conservatives in 2014, after being called for by 100 years by Indigenous people, is now even more modest, actually. It's been refined even more. And what's come through the Parliament in recent months and what we will all vote on is a very robust, modest, pragmatic proposal which simply requires Parliament to establish an Indigenous advisory body. So it keeps Parliament totally in charge. And it boils down to a yes or no question. Do we say yes to finally recognising Indigenous people in the Constitution, from which they were excluded in 1901, by giving them a voice, an advisory voice in laws and policies made about them? That's all. Not a veto, not any kind of third chamber, just a constitutionally guaranteed advisory voice.
Shireen, you've just spoken to the power, I guess, of people with opposing views coming together to make more refined and more practical solutions. We don't seem to be having that kind of discourse in the current debate right now, do we?
Yeah, and it is very disappointing. You know, Noel always used to talk about the radical centre, you know, when left and right can come together, when the best ideas from across the political spectrum combine and coalesce and create a truly innovative idea, a brilliant reform. And that was, I think the Voice is a radical centre innovation in that it combined, it reconciled the aspirations of Indigenous people for constitutional recognition with practical outcomes, you know, practical constitutional recognition. It reconciled those aspirations with the concerns that constitutional conservatives were expressing. And what we got was a modest, balanced, a very balanced reform. And it wasn't a reform that was owned by Labor, you know, and I think the great shame of the political debate we're having now is that this is a proposal that came from Indigenous people. Indigenous people have been asking for a voice for over 100 years, and it came from their collaboration with conservatives, you know? And people like Julie and Lisa were pushing for this before Labor got on board. The deeply disappointing thing is that the coalition didn't run with that. They had every opportunity to. They had 9 years in government. It was a proposal that came from one of their people, you know, and they should have owned it. You know, John Howard was the one who put recognition on the agenda. So they squandered that opportunity. And Labor seized the opportunity, and Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, to his great credit, is putting this to the people. And unfortunately, Peter Dutton has decided to make this a political issue. But having said that, there are a lot of Liberals, a lot of Conservatives who do support this. Not only Lisa, people like Senator Andrew Bragg, Senator Bridget McKenzie. One of the latest people was the New South Wales Liberal leader, Mark Speakman, a very respected barrister and senior counsel. He agrees with the Liberal-appointed Solicitor General. He says this voice will be an enhancement of our democracy. So the work was not in vain, you know, because there is significant and serious support across the political spectrum. It's a shame there's not formal bipartisan support, but that's politics.
Yes, it does seem to be that way. Look, I'm sure when Julie and Lisa stepped down, it was probably news to a lot of people that there ever had been constitutional conservative support throughout the whole of, you know, LNP party government for what, nearly a decade, is it?
Yeah, so that was 9 years ago.
Yeah, that's right. It is nearly a decade, and many people, because it's effectively a generation ago now, would also probably not even remember that Howard was the one who put recognition on the table originally. So, given the heightened state of partisan opposition over the yes and no campaigns at the moment, you've talked a lot in great detail about the history of where this has come from and also the thinking that went into it, bringing people together from different sides. But what's the one really, really simple thing that for people who are just, genuinely undecided and would like to know more, what's the one really, really simple thing that's going to bring people back to the centre? What's the one thing that they need to understand so that they actually do see that the Yes campaign is not a left or right position, but it is a balanced position that's more than the sum of its parts from all the people who put effort into it?
I think you hit the nail on the head when you said it's not a left or right position. A referendum is not an election. It's fundamentally different to an election. It's a question that gets put directly to the Australian people, and we all need to vote on this in good conscience. So it's not about Labor or Liberal, it's not about left or right. It's about right and wrong, I think, and people need to understand this boils down to a moral question, a yes or no question. Do Indigenous people deserve to finally be recognised in the Constitution, from which they were excluded in 1901, through having an advisory voice in their affairs? And it's also important for people to understand that, Indigenous people were excluded from the original Constitution of 1901, explicitly excluded under race-based clauses. And because of that, the Constitution set up this unfair top-down power relationship with Indigenous people. Noel always used to talk about the elephant and the mouse dynamic that characterises that relationship, because you've got this Indigenous people being 3% of the population, you've got this 3% mouse squeaking and trying to be heard by this almighty 97% non-Indigenous elephant that wields all the power under our Constitution. And the elephant might not always be a bad guy, but it's hard for the elephant to hear the mouse, And so the mouse gets trampled. And that's why you've had this history flowing from that unfair power relationship. Laws that denied Indigenous people the vote in some jurisdictions until the 60s. And indeed, perfect formal equality in voting rights wasn't achieved until something like 1983, because it wasn't compulsory for them to vote before them. Policies that denied them equal wages for their hard work, sometimes no wages, have some rations instead. Policies that controlled where they could live, who they could marry, sometimes banned their languages from being spoken. Of course, we all know, denied their property rights. But even today, even though most of that harsh discrimination was in the past, today the top-down power dynamic is still in play. You just have to have a look at what the Productivity Commission said a few weeks ago. The Productivity Commission said Australia's failing to close the gap. Why? Because everything's top-down. Because bureaucrats and governments don't listen to Indigenous communities. So this is about fixing that unfair power relationship by guaranteeing Indigenous people can at least have a better say when Parliament and government make laws and policies about them. That's what this is about, recognition through a voice, practical recognition through a voice.
How long has the Closing the Gap program been around? It was a Howard initiative, wasn't it?
It started in 2007.
That's right.
That's when it was inaugurated, and then it was revised in 2017. When it began in 2007, I believe there were 17 targets, and then after the revision process leading to the new Close the Gap strategy in 2017, there were 46 targets. But along with those targets, there are sub-targets, if you like, social indicators.
So my question to both of you, but feel free to take turns if you like. Has the gap ever been closed?
Only on 2 of the 46 indicators are we making any progress. So officially, no, but there is a very odd little statistic that I know about because of my work with Professor Ian Anderson, who played a significant role in the revision of the targets, and that is universities have closed the gap on the enrolment of Indigenous students in first year medicine, or at least that was the outcome before the pandemic. And that was largely because of the Leaders in Medical Education program that Ian started with the Deans of Medicine across the universities of Australia.
And I thought it was interesting what the Productivity Commission said. They said government doesn't understand the scale of structural change needed, and it kind of reminded me of the elephant metaphor, that it's just hard for the bureaucracy to change the way it does business. And that's why I actually think a yes vote would be so powerful in a way, because if we all vote, if Australians vote yes, and it's hard to change the Constitution. So if we vote yes, it'd be like only the ninth time we've done it since 1901. We'd be making a national commitment to listening, dialogue, partnership, mutual respect. And that, in the end, could change the culture, the policy making and political culture. And that's where the power of this lies. That cultural change, so that listening, dialogue becomes the norm. That is what will lead to better policies and better outcomes.
Look, I think it's true that Australia is geographically quite a big place. The chances are that local challenges are unlikely to be understood by people without skin in the game in providing local solutions, or at least attempting to over long periods of time. But I think the question is probably more than geographical, isn't it? I mean, the failure to understand the scale of it, what is driving that? Is it only geography, or is it more than that, do you think?
What do you think, Marcia?
Well, I talk about the burden of history. And so what most people don't understand, because so many Australians know so very little about their history, is that, yeah, sure, Captain Cook arrived, well, actually Lieutenant James Cook sailed up the east coast of Australia and made a couple of stops in 1770, and Lieutenant Phillip came with the first fleet in 1788, and after mucking around going to the south of what is now La Perouse, he ended up in what is now Sydney Harbour at what he called Port Jackson. But the frontier that was unleashed about a year after the First Fleet landing at Port Jackson rolled on, in Henry Reynolds' words, there was a rolling frontier for another 150 years. The violence of the settlers towards Aboriginal people did not end officially until well into the 1920s, and I can think of a few cases that have not been recorded after that. And of course there was the impact of the epidemics of disease such as smallpox, influenza, measles, that so radically depopulated entire areas, especially along the rivers. And that's how these diseases spread. And then, of course, not only the violence, but also with Aboriginal people being pushed off their land, they starved. Many were forced into starvation. And so the depopulation and the crippling of remaining populations was then followed by incarceration. People were rounded up and put into reserves, institutionalised for at least another 70 years. And so the profound impacts of this historical burden are reflected in a highly localised way according to the history of each area, the impacts on each population. And of course we have these huge diasporas of people spreading out across the country to flee from the violence. We've ended up with such a complicated social phenomenon now of in small Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations in rural and remote settlements and in towns, and then larger Aboriginal populations in cities and big towns. And the challenge of closing the gap, the challenge of reaching parity on health and education outcomes or employment outcomes means that we have to focus on the highly local, we have to focus on social networks, we have to focus on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander local leadership. And anyway, I'm not the one being interviewed here, but that's just my take on it.
It's a discussion.
Yeah, and look, the thing that gets me, Marcia, listening to your description of the history there, I mean, you know, after everything Indigenous people have been through in this country, after the exclusion, the dispossession, the violence, you know, they're actually coming to us non-Indigenous people and saying, despite the way we've been treated in the past, despite the fact that we've been excluded, we would like to be included, please. You know, we'd like to be recognised in the Constitution formally and permanently. And all they're asking for is an advisory voice in their affairs. That they've been through all of that you just described, and all they're asking for is the ability to give non-binding advice when Parliament and government make laws and policies about them. I mean, it is a profoundly modest and generous request when you think about it in historical context. You know, it's the hand outstretched, like everyone keeps saying. How can, you know, it's just an amazing opportunity for this country to heal some of these historical wrongs that you just talked about, or at least start to heal them. It's an extraordinarily generous offer that Indigenous people have made, I think.
Yes, and then the problem is, and as you well know, what the referendum question proposes is recognition through a voice that would make representations to Parliament and executive government on matters that affect us. And yet the No campaign is delivering messages to the voters to give the impression that we've got our hand out, not to invite them to work with us to overcome failed policies and failure to close the gap, but rather they're saying that, you know, we've got our hand out for money, which is why they're saying if you vote yes, the Aborigines will get compensation. So please take us through the question and the actual nature of the voice that is being proposed.
Yeah, that's great, because you'll notice that the No case want to talk about everything other than the actual constitutional change that we're voting on, right? They want to talk about welcome to country, they want to talk about submarines, parking tickets, you know, anything other than the actual constitutional change, which I think tells us a lot. The constitutional change is very simple. The first line is a line of recognition. It simply says, in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia. It just states that fact, that historical fact. And of course, that's why we're having this whole conversation, right? We're talking about recognising Indigenous people in the Constitution from which they were previously excluded. So we're having this whole conversation to move from exclusion to inclusion of Indigenous people. Then the first line of the clause, clause 1, says there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Clause 1 is like the guarantee. So if we all vote yes to this, clause 1 is us Australians making a promise, making a national commitment that Indigenous people will always have a voice in laws and policies made about them, that Indigenous communities will always be heard. So clause 1 is like our commitment, our promise. Clause 2 says what the job of this body is. It says the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice may make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So the job of this voice is that it can make representations. Now, that's just a more modest way of saying can give advice. Back in 2014, when we worked on this original version of the drafting, we used the word advice. But somewhere along the way, over 8-9 years, the legal experts switched that to representations to make doubly, triply clear that no one could make the argument that advice by convention should be followed in the same way that advice from ministers to the Governor-General should be followed. To ensure that there was no expectation that advice should be followed, they used the word representations. So that's actually more modest to confirm that this is just non-binding. Those representations, the body's advice, can be made to Parliament and the executive government. You might have heard some of the furor earlier this year about whether the voice should be allowed to advise the executive.
Yep.
Let me tell you that the idea that the voice should advise the executive was actually in there from the beginning. And in fact, it was in there because constitutional conservatives, particularly Julie and Lisa, reminded us how important it is that this Indigenous advisory body be able to advise on policy development. He reminded us that by the time policy positions get to Parliament, they're very locked in and difficult to change. He said, if you want this body to have real practical impact to help us close the gap, the body needs to engage with the government on policy development. That's why this voice is able to advise both the Parliament and the executive on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Not submarines, not parking tickets, matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Now, Clause 3 is really important. It says, the Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, including its composition, functions, powers and procedures. So when people ask, where's the detail of how this body will look? Who's hiding the detail? Why haven't we seen the detail? Everyone should show that person the constitutional change and point them to Clause 3. Because Clause 3 says it's Parliament's job to legislate, to enact the detail. It's Parliament's job to legislate to determine the composition, functions, powers and procedures of the voice. And note, it doesn't say that it's the government's job. It's not up to Anthony Albanese to decide how this voice will look and all the details. No, the Constitution, if this gets through, will say that it is Parliament's job. That means Labor, Liberals, the Teals, Greens, One Nation, everyone in Parliament will get a say on how this body looks and how it operates. So I think in this debate, people need to be reminded that what we are voting on are these words. Yes or no? Are we saying yes or no to these words being put in the Constitution? And I think the words are very self-explanatory. You don't have to be a constitutional lawyer to understand them. They're very simple. It's recognition through a voice, an advisory voice, and it's totally up to Parliament, our elected representatives, to say how this voice will look and how it will function. And importantly, future parliaments can change the legislation. So future parliaments can create a different voice, can change the details, right? So this is not about the detail. This is about the principle. And the principle boils down to a yes-no proposition. Do we say yes to recognising Indigenous people in the Constitution through an advisory voice in their own affairs? If we say yes, then it's Parliament's job to legislate all the detail.
I'm just wondering, because there is such a healthy amount of scepticism about what practical benefits the model might have if voted up. As a trained lawyer, how do you see practical benefits flowing to Indigenous communities in your particular profession if this actually does get voted in?
I think it'll have immense benefit, and particularly through the cultural change that a yes vote will instill, like I was talking about before. But I'll give you a recent example. Recently in the Northern Territory, local Indigenous communities were pleading with governments and warning them not to allow alcohol management bans to lapse, right? They were set to lapse, and they warned, and governments didn't listen. And the bans were removed, and a lot of harm ensued. And then governments had to scramble to put the bans back in place. Now, I think if Indigenous communities had had a constitutionally guaranteed advisory voice in their affairs, then I think those concerns of those local communities would have been amplified and they would have been heard. And I think the culture would have been such that hopefully those concerns would not have been ignored. And I think a lot of harm and a lot of waste could have been avoided. You know, Marcia talked before about the fear-mongering about, you know, supposedly this is not a hand outstretched in peace from Indigenous people. Supposedly it's a hand out asking for money, which is just rubbish. In fact, a mechanism like this has the ability to really cut waste, you know, because the current situation is that a lot of money is spent and there are a lot of good intentions, but the gap's not on track to close. And on some indicators, we're actually going backwards, right? So I think this mechanism, empowering local Indigenous communities around the country to actually tell government what works and what doesn't work, I think that has the potential to actually save us money. Because if we listen to local Indigenous communities, we can make better decisions, achieve better practical results, and gain efficiencies along the way by avoiding the mistakes like the one I talked about in the Northern Territory.
Yes, I think that too. I think that there's a lot of inefficiency in the system because, of course, it takes quite a long time for people to work in these spaces and come up to speed. And, you know, again, if you're from the community and you've lived there your entire life, you're much more likely to have an idea of what it's like on the ground.
So just on that, the Leader of the Opposition, Peter Dutton, continues to demand detail, and I believe that he's misleading the public egregiously because he won't admit that it's his duty as a politician to help design that detail eventually when we have the hopefully a constitutional amendment that will permit that to occur. So that's my personal view. What is your view on this constant refrain about demanding detail as a constitutional lawyer, but also as a person who's worked so hard to get us all to this point where...
You're completely right, Marcia. It's a complete red herring. You know, Clause 3 of the Constitutional Amendment says that it's Parliament's job to legislate all the detail of how this will work and how the voice will look. So when Peter Dutton asks, where's the detail? Well, it's your job, Peter Dutton. Your job, just like it's every other parliamentarian's job to legislate the detail if Australians vote yes. The thing I'd say as a constitutional lawyer is that the approach makes perfect sense. You know, the Constitution is Australia's highest legal rule book. It's the document that sets out high-level principles for how our country is run, and it's the document that tells Parliament to set up the important institutions in our country. What the Constitution doesn't do is set out all the nuts and bolts details of those institutions. Why? Because the details of institutions need to be flexible. You don't want to lock details into the Constitution where they can't be changed easily. Details need to evolve. Institutions need to evolve. That's why details belong in legislation where they can be flexible, where they can be changed, right? So the Constitution is for principle, and this referendum is about the principle. Yes or no? Do we say that Indigenous people deserve to be recognised in the Constitution through having a say in laws and policies made about them, an advisory say? If we say yes, then it's Parliament's job, including the Liberal parties and Peter Dutton's job, to legislate the detail and evolve that detail over time as necessary.
Yeah, thanks for that very clear explanation. And so then my next question is, given that that's the case, and as I understand it, the vast majority of constitutional lawyers would agree with you on that. If they didn't, one would wonder where they got their law degrees from. How is it then that the No campaign can send messages to the public such as, well, if you vote yes, Aborigines will get compensation, or if you vote yes, the secret agenda is treaties. So what's going on there, Shireen?
I think they're just distraction tactics. Talk about anything other than the actual constitutional change we're voting on, because the constitutional change is sensible. And they know it's sensible. They know that some members of their own party were involved in forming this, some serious Conservatives were involved in forming this constitutional change. They know that the Solicitor General they appointed endorses it, calls it an enhancement of democracy, not to mention other Liberal leaders like Mark Speakman and Jeremy Rockcliffe, Premier of Tasmania. So these are distraction tactics and they are fear-mongering tactics, and it's not, it's not against the law to lie in this manner. And these are lies. And all Australians can do is seek out the facts, have this conversation in a factual, respectful way. When you hear misinformation, fight it with facts and truth. That's all we can do. And look, the other lie that Peter Dutton and the No case tell is that this would reinsert race back into the Constitution, or that this would divide us by race. That's completely incorrect. Unfortunately, Australians have been divided by race under the Constitution since 1901. Indigenous people were excluded from the Constitution under race-based provisions, and no group in Australia has suffered more because of the fact that they were treated as if they were an inferior race, and race-based provisions are still in the Constitution. So it is a complete lie that this inserts race back into the Constitution. Race is already in there. This is about fixing the race-based exclusion and discrimination of the past and moving to inclusion, recognition. So, it's the opposite of what they're saying. As I said before, if we vote yes, we'd be voting yes to listening, partnership, dialogue. That's about unity. That's about togetherness. It's the opposite of division. So the No case tactic is to use fear to divide us, and it's really sad to see some of the arguments being floated, but all we can do is refute them with the facts.
I almost don't know where to go from that. I mean, that was a stunning assessment, I think, and an important one.
Yeah. What would you say to an undecided voter at any time in the next 4 or 5 weeks about how they could inform themselves in order to make a decision on how they will vote? And I ask this question because the slogan of the No campaign is, if you don't know, vote no.
Yeah, that's a very lazy instruction, isn't it? Just stay ignorant and, no, I wouldn't advise that. If you don't know, get informed. There's a lot of fantastic information out there. I'd recommend you go to yes23.com.au. Voice.gov.au is really excellent. The government's website on this question, voice.gov.au. It has the constitutional change wording up there, design principles up there, and just a very clear, simple explanation. We've been assisting with a multicultural website called multiculturalforvoice.org. If you go there, you'll see fact sheets and informations that are translated into lots and lots of different languages. I actually think multicultural communities are going to be really, really important in this referendum. And I think there's really a lot of goodwill and empathy in migrant communities for this cause once they get the accurate information. So that website's multiculturalforvoice.org. But definitely get informed, Don't make an ignorant decision. We're really privileged to live in a democracy like Australia. And one of the privileges of being a citizen and an Australian is the ability to participate in our democracy. And this is a historic moment for our democracy. We're deciding whether or not to recognise Indigenous people in the Constitution. We're deciding whether or not they will get a voice in laws and policies made about Indigenous affairs. It's a very crucial decision, important decision that every Australian needs to make in an informed way.
You are right about the democracy aspect. I'm reminded, having travelled to a few other countries this year, that this is not a debate that could actually openly happen in a lot of other places in the world. There are many other places where this just would not even be a question because, of course, it could never be asked because people don't live in open democracies elsewhere. I think that we probably take that too much for granted. We probably don't understand just how valuable the political system that we do have actually is.
Totally. But you know what? I think it's something that migrants really do understand, because our families, we came here for a better life, and we love Australia for that reason. As I said, I'm Indian and Fijian Indian background, and my parents came here at the end of the White Australia policy. And they came from poor backgrounds, but they got scholarships and came and, studied and stuff. And because they were given that opportunity, I was lucky to be born Australian, and I've had access to all this opportunity and all this prosperity that they would never have known, and that's why I think, many migrants love Australia. But when we understand the history, we know that Indigenous Australians simply have not had access to the same opportunity. And I'll give you two examples. When I was doing my PhD research, I came across this story of this Indian guy in Victoria, Mita Bulosh. And back then it wasn't only Indigenous people who were banned from voting in some jurisdictions. Indians, Pacific Islanders, Maori were also banned. And this Indian guy, Mita Bulosh, he went to court and challenged his exclusion from voting. And the Commonwealth subsequently changed the law, this is in the 1920s, to allow Indian people the right to vote, but not Indigenous people. So Indigenous people didn't get the right to vote until some 4 decades later, So that reminds me, if only that Indian guy had stood in solidarity with his Indigenous counterparts at that time, justice for everyone might have been achieved earlier. The second example, sorry?
What year was that?
1920-something, yeah. And the second example I learned when I went up to Cape York Institute, and because when my parents came to Melbourne, they could go house hunting. They could buy a house back when property prices were a lot lower and build wealth to pass on to me and my brother. I learned that the Wik people up at Arakoon, they couldn't even buy back their own traditional land that they had lived on for thousands of years because of a Queensland policy saying Aboriginal people were not allowed to buy large tracts of land. So they went to court, challenged that law, and it got struck down under the Racial Discrimination Act. But the Premier, Joe Bjelke-Petersen, quickly declared the land a national park so that it couldn't be purchased, So you go up to Arakoon now, that is a community suffering immense disadvantage. So there's a reason Indian Australians in this country are doing better than the Wik people up at Arakoon. There are historical and structural reasons, you know. And so this referendum might be our one chance to give back to Indigenous people who've lost so much in our history so that this great democracy could be built on their land. And we've all benefited from that. And what are they asking us to do in return? They're asking us to write yes, the word yes, in a box on 14th October.
When you put it like that, it's an opportunity that absolutely cannot be squandered. We are lucky to be born Australian, but we need to make sure that everybody is equally lucky to be born Australian, including the people who were here first.
Absolutely.
I think I've noticed, and it's interesting to know your views on this, I've noticed genuine confusion amongst people who, you know, are not lawyers or constitutional experts. People seem to worry that the Voice, if voted up, will somehow negate treaty negotiations, all of which are happening at the state level, by the way, from sort of happening. And I think maybe we don't quite understand that these are happening in completely different jurisdictions of Australia. I mean, nothing that can be voted up at a federal referendum could negate what a state is trying to do at the local level, could it?
No, of course not. This is a simple
They're
question.
They're completely separate processes. They're completely segmented off
separate
from each
issue.
other, aren't they? Yeah.
This is a simple question. Yeah. Do we want to recognise Indigenous people in the Constitution, and do we want to give them a guaranteed advisory voice? That's the decision. Yeah. You know, all these extraneous discussions are not relevant to this question.
So to be clear, the treaty processes, and they're underway where? Victoria, Western Australia, and where's the third jurisdiction?
Oh, I don't think they're underway in Western Australia. I thought it was Victoria, Northern Territory, South Australia. Is that right, Marcia? Oh, Queensland.
Queensland, Victoria, and the Northern Territory. But I think what Aaron's referring to there, is the opinion of George Williams,
yes.
And is it Harry Hobbs?
Oh, right.
On the nature of the Noongar settlement.
Yes.
They describe it as a modern treaty.
Well, right. So they argue that there's already native title agreements that are akin to treaties. So the fact is, you know, this fear-mongering argument that the Voice will lead to this kind of agreement making, well, this kind of agreement making is already happening, according to some experts. Look, I think it's a separate question. This is a question about the Constitution. Do we want to recognise Indigenous people by giving them a voice, yes or no?
That's good. That's very clear. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I think we nailed it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thanks for your time, Shireen. It's really wonderful to get to talk to you at length like this.
Yes.
Oh, no, it's such an honour to be invited, and let's hope that we can get it out there and dispel some confusion. That would be good.